The fence was splintered, but not as badly as her heart. When a silent man with calloused hands came to fix the boards, her daughter stood barefoot in the grass and whispered, "Could you fix Mama, too?" He didn't knock, just started working. That's how Nora first noticed him. Sawdust on his sleeves, a hammer in his belt, a far-off gaze like he didn't want to be seen at all. Her fence had blown out in the storm, boards leaning like drunkards, gate hanging off a single rusted hinge. She'd thought about fixing it herself, but time and sorrow had hollowed her days until lifting a hammer felt impossible. So, when the man arrived, silent as dusk, she'd only watched from the porch, the child asleep on her shoulder and the other barefoot in the yard. Her youngest, Clara, had been the first to speak. "Mama," she'd whispered, tugging gently at Nora's skirt. "There's a man fixing our fence." Nora stepped out, adjusted the baby on her hip, and shaded her eyes from the rising sun. He was already on his knees, hammer tapping rhythmically. No glance toward the house. She didn't recognize him. Not from town, not from the chapel, not from the mill. Just a tall man with a sun-worn face and arms that looked like they could bend iron. "Sir?" she called. He didn't answer, just reached for another board and kept hammering. For a moment she thought he hadn't heard. Then he paused, stood, and tipped his hat toward her. His eyes were kind but burdened. He didn't speak, only nodded once, then returned to his work. And something in Nora, something deep, small, and cracked, didn't mind the silence. He came every morning for the rest of the week. She tried to ask him his name once, offered coffee another time, even sent Clara out with a bundle of sweetbread. He only nodded each time, ate the bread by the tree stump, and sipped the coffee like it hurt to taste something warm. He didn't flinch when her boys came tumbling out of the house, loud and wrestling in the dust. Didn't blink when Clara fell and bloodied her knee. He just picked her up, dusted her off, and nodded to Nora again, as if to say, "I got her." That's when Clara asked him. She stood near the gate one afternoon while he adjusted the hinges. Her little hands gripping the post. She tilted her head and looked up at him with those eyes that seemed to pull truth from stone. "You fixed our fence. Could you fix my mama's heart too?" He froze, hammer midair. Didn't look at Clara, didn't move. Nora stood in the doorway, heart pounding like he'd swung that hammer right into her ribs. She opened her mouth to call Clara back, but couldn't speak. He lowered the hammer slowly. Clara didn't move either. Then, without a word, he finished nailing the hinge, straightened the post, and walked away. Nora didn't sleep that night. She'd known loss, but never like this. Her husband had been gone 4 years, not dead, just vanished. One morning, he saddled up and said he'd be back by nightfall. She'd cooked stew and put on her best dress. The stew cooled, the dress wrinkled. He never returned, no note, no goodbye, just silence. People talked. Maybe he'd been killed on the trail. Maybe he'd run off with the woman who sold cloth near the square. Maybe he'd ridden east, tired of the land. But in her bones, Nora knew he'd left because grief had made her heavy, because her laughter had gone brittle, because she'd cried into her pillow too many nights and stopped putting sugar in her coffee. He hadn't wanted a ghost for a wife. Now, she wasn't sure if she was still alive herself, just moving, feeding mouths, changing sheets, mending tears, a ghost with a spine. But that man, the one who fixed her fence, he hadn't looked away when Clara asked her question. He hadn't laughed or smiled or scolded. He'd just frozen, like something cracked wide open inside him too. The next morning, he didn't come. Nor the next. A week passed. The gate was straight now. Fence sturdy, no reason to return. Nora tried to forget the weight of his silence, the strength of his back, the way Clara's head fit just beneath his hand like she belonged there. Then one evening, Clara vanished. Nora had only stepped inside to check the stew. 3 minutes, 5 at most. The boys were still in the yard playing marbles, but Clara was gone. Nora ran out barefoot, hair undone, heart wild. She searched the well, the barn, the road, the neighbors' lots. Nothing, until she saw the footprints. Tiny ones, leading toward the woods. She didn't think. She just ran. Branches tore at her arms. Thorns caught her dress. Her lungs burned. But she followed those prints deeper, past where the trees thinned and the sky darkened. She almost didn't hear it. The sound of a voice, low and rough, reading. Reading. She stumbled into a clearing and stopped cold. There, seated on a log beside a tiny cabin, was Clara, tucked against the silent man's side. He held a book, open in his lap, his voice barely above the wind. He wasn't reading fairy tales or anything light. It was scripture. Psalms. Clara had fallen asleep against him. Nora stepped forward, eyes wide, breath ragged. He looked up, startled, then rose slowly, lifting Clara in his arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know she's all right," he said, his voice low and rough. It was the first time she'd heard him speak. He walked toward her, carefully, like she was something wounded. When he reached her, he passed Clara gently into her arms, then stepped back. "Why didn't you come back?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked down. "Didn't think I should?" "Because of what she said?" He nodded once. Didn't tell her to say it," Nora whispered. "I know." Silence stretched between them, wind in the trees, the far-off hoot of an owl. "I lost someone," he said quietly. 3 winters back. Nora held Clara closer. "I'm sorry. She was everything. I tried to keep going. Built this cabin, chopped wood, ate alone." She nodded slowly, eyes wet. "I came to fix the fence because I needed something to fix. Clara didn't mean to hurt you. She didn't. She misses having someone." His eyes lifted to hers. "Don't we all?" She should have said thank you, should have turned and gone, but her feet stayed rooted and the silence between them didn't feel heavy this time. It felt safe. "Will you walk us back?" she asked softly. He nodded. He walked beside her, not touching, not speaking, but steady. She listened to the crunch of twigs under his boots, the rustle of the baby's breath against her neck, and the sound of her own heart waking up after 4 long years. When they reached the edge of the clearing near her fence, he paused. "I'm sorry I left." "You didn't," she said. "You were just quiet." He smiled faintly. "Will you come back tomorrow?" His eyes searched hers. "Only if I'm wanted." "You are." She turned before she could cry, her children safe in her arms. Behind her, the quiet man stood in the dark, watching her walk away like she was something he'd never expected to see again. He came at sunrise. Didn't knock, didn't call, just stood by the fence, hands in his coat pockets, watching the frost melt off the gate he'd repaired 2 weeks prior. Nora saw him through the kitchen window where she was whisking eggs with one hand and steadying the baby, on her hip with the other. Her breath caught for a second. She hadn't expected him so soon, or maybe she had and had dressed a little better that morning without quite knowing why. He waited, head bowed. When Clara saw him, she shot up from her chair, scattering her spoon across the floor. "He's back!" she cried, and bolted outside before Nora could say a word. Clara hugged him around the knees, fearless as always, and he crouched to her level, still saying nothing, just looked at her with those soft eyes and nodded once. Then his gaze rose slowly to meet Nora's, who'd stepped onto the porch in her shawl and house shoes, the baby still tucked into her hip. She didn't speak either. Not right away. Just looked at him like a question she wasn't ready to ask. "You came." "You asked?" The words were simple, but something in them shook her. "I made coffee." He hesitated, then stepped forward. Nora didn't have much. The table was old and scraped, one leg shorter than the others, so the salt always slid downhill. Her china was mismatched. 2 good cups, 3 chipped ones, and 1 with a crack she never dared pour hot water into. But she set out what she had, buttered the cornbread, and folded cloth napkins like it mattered. He sat across from her, back straight, hat off. The children were still half-dressed and bouncing around like colts, and he didn't seem to mind. The baby burbled. Clara climbed onto his lap like she'd always belonged there, and he let her, carefully steadying her with a hand as broad as her back. It was Clara who broke the silence again. "Are you going to marry my mama?" Nora choked on her coffee. His eyebrows shot up. "Clara." "Well," the little girl reasoned, unbothered, "you fixed our fence and read me stories and came back. That's what papas do." He didn't answer, but Nora saw something flicker across his face. Not shock, not humor. Something older. Something sad and tender and almost afraid. "I'm sorry," Nora muttered, reaching to take Clara off his lap. "No," he said quietly, gently stopping her hand. "She's all right." His voice did something to her, like thunder from far off, like a promise of rain after months of dust. "You never told us your name," she said, hoping to deflect. He looked at her a moment before answering. "Caleb." She repeated it, softly. "Caleb." The baby reached for his beard. Clara giggled. That morning turned into afternoon. He helped lift the water bucket from the well, carried kindling from the woodshed, tightened the hinges on the chicken coop door. Never asked, never waited to be told, just did. Nora watched him, noticed how his fingers were steady, how he checked each job twice, how he wiped his boots before stepping onto the porch like he was entering a church. And each time he looked at her, something in her chest pulled tight. By sundown, she offered him supper. He didn't answer immediately, just looked down at his boots like he didn't trust himself to accept. "You don't have to," she added, quickly, standing behind her chair. "I know," he said, "but I'd like to." She smiled. The meal was simple. Potatoes, cornbread, beans, and a small dish of pickled beets. She set a place for him at the head of the table. The children quieted for once, as if instinctively knowing that something holy was taking place. He said grace, not loudly, but sincerely, and for the first time in years, Nora bowed her head and believed someone else's words could cover. Her too, after the meal he rose to leave. "I'll walk you to the gate," she offered. He nodded. They stepped outside. The moon had risen, casting silver over the fields. The air smelled like hay and distant river water. They walked in silence until they reached the fence line. "Why did you come back, really?" she asked, arms crossed against the chill. He looked at her, long and quiet. "Because I didn't want to leave," he finally said. Her heart beat hard. "I lost my wife," he continued, 5 years ago. We were trying for children, but God didn't give us any. I thought maybe if I built enough, fixed enough, I could stop remembering that my arms are empty." She swallowed. "You don't seem empty." He met her eyes. "Not anymore." The wind passed between them. Her fingers brushed his by accident, but neither of them moved. "You don't have to fix anything else," she whispered. His voice cracked. "I want to." He left her there, under the moonlight, and she watched him go with a heart fuller than it had been in years, but peace, like spring, comes late and fleeting. 2 days later, the sheriff arrived. He rode up with dust on his jacket and tension in his jaw. Nora met him on the porch, holding the baby and already bracing herself for something unwelcome. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat, "need to ask you something." "What's wrong?" "You been seeing a man out here? Tall, quiet, maybe, mid-40s. Her breath caught. "Why?" "We got a report from Pine Hollow. Widow woman down there says a man's been poking around her property. Matches the description. Says he's harmless, but odd. Fixes things. Doesn't speak much." Nora tightened her hold on the baby. That doesn't sound like a crime. Didn't say it was, but folks get uneasy when someone shows up fixing. What ain't theirs to fix? She stepped forward. He's not bothering anyone. He's been helping. Got a name? Caleb. The sheriff nodded slowly like he'd heard it before. Just keep an eye open. Some men carry grief like dynamite. Looks harmless till it blows. She didn't answer. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode off. That night she waited. But Caleb didn't come. By morning, Clara was crying. The boys were restless. The baby wouldn't sleep. By afternoon, Nora saddled up the mule and rode out. She followed the path through the woods, over the creek, up the rocky incline where his cabin stood, hidden in the trees. But when she reached the clearing, it was empty. Door hanging open. Woodpile half chopped. Fire cold. She stepped inside. The place smelled like pine and dust. A Bible lay open on the table. Beside it, a folded scrap of paper. She picked it up, hands trembling. It read, "I didn't mean to make a home where I wasn't invited. Thank you for letting me remember what warmth feels like. I won't forget." Nora sat down hard, tears blinding her. She stayed there until the baby stirred, then rose and gathered her coat. She tucked the note into her pocket and stepped outside. Clara would ask questions, so would the boys. And Nora had no answers. But deep down, beneath the ache, a stubborn little ember flickered. Because the man who fixed her fence had almost fixed her too, and maybe, just maybe, she wasn't done hoping. The days after Caleb disappeared dragged like boots through deep snow. Clara sat by the gate every afternoon with her chin resting on her hands, eyes fixed on the bend in the road where he had once emerged with a toolbox in hand and a quiet nod for every greeting. She never said it out loud, but Nora knew she was waiting for him. Nora tried to fill the space he'd left, tried to hum while she cooked, tried to laugh when the boys knocked over the wash bucket or tracked mud through the kitchen. But her voice, caught in her throat every time she thought of that folded note, still tucked inside her apron drawer like something too sacred to throw out, too painful to reread. A week passed. Then 2. Then, on a morning when frost curled up the fence posts and the water trough iced over solid, she found a bundle tied with twine at the edge of the yard. No footprints led to it. No sound had woken her. Just the bundle, neatly wrapped in burlap, sitting beside the gate like a quiet confession. She hesitated before picking it up. Inside, she found a sack of flour, a tin of tea, and 3 small wooden carvings, each shaped like a child. Each one bore the exact likeness of her boys and Clara, down to the curls on Clara's head and the tooth gap in Daniel's smile. Her knees gave out and she sank to the porch steps, the bundle clutched to her chest. He had come in the night. He had stood there, watched the house, left something behind. She didn't tell the children, not yet. Let them keep hoping without feeding it. But she began to leave the lamp burning on the windowsill again, and every night she looked out toward the trees just once before going to bed. Winter deepened. The snow came thick, then melted too quickly, leaving mud and rot in its wake. One of the hens got sick. The roof sprang a leak. The mule threw a shoe. There was too much work and not enough daylight, but Nora kept going. She always had. Then, one night, someone knocked. Not the sheriff, not a neighbor. The knock was soft, unsure. She lit the lamp and opened the door, half expecting nothing to be there. But he stood just past the threshold. Caleb, soaked to the knees, beard untrimmed, his coat weighed down with sleet. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "I couldn't stay away," he said. The lamp flickered between them. The baby started crying in the next room. "I can't offer you anything," she said finally. "Not even certainty." He nodded. "Then we're even." She stepped aside. He didn't move. "I'm not whole," he added quietly. "I'm not sure I ever will be, but I I know how to build. I know how to repair. I don't know if I'm any good at loving again." Her voice trembled. "I don't need perfect. I just need someone who won't leave when things crack." They stood like that in the doorway for what felt like an hour. Then Clara barreled in, nightgown dragging, hair tangled. "You came back," she shouted, throwing her arms around his legs. His breath hitched. "I came back." Nora let the door close softly behind him. That night, he slept on the floor by the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket, the boys curled near him like pups. Nora sat awake in the rocker, baby in her arms, watching the flames dance and wondering if she'd dared too much by letting him back in. But dawn came, and with it, something like hope. Caleb stayed, not officially, not as a boarder or anything. That carried labels. He just never left again. He fixed the mule's shoe, patched the roof, rebuilt the chicken coop, and every evening he sat beside the children on the porch and whittled animals out of kindling, telling them stories in his quiet voice. And slowly, something shifted. He didn't sleep on the floor anymore. The boys began calling him Uncle Caleb, though Clara was still waiting for the right moment to call him something else. Nora let the moments come without rushing them, like buds in early spring, fragile, shy, but real. One night, as she was washing dishes in the dim kitchen, she looked up and saw him brushing Clara's hair gently on the porch steps. She leaned against the window frame and just watched. She didn't need anyone to fix her heart. She just needed someone who would hold it like it mattered. Then came the letter. It arrived in a dust-covered satchel dropped by a rider passing through, addressed to Nora from a cousin she barely knew. She unfolded the paper with care, frowning at the unfamiliar scrawl. The cousin's name was Rebecca, and her words were rushed, desperate. She'd lost her husband, had no children, and was drowning under the debt of their ranch 2 towns over. She'd heard Nora was still alive and begged for help. Not money, just a place to stay while she sorted things out. Nora showed the letter to Caleb that night. He read it in silence. "You want her here?" he asked finally. "I don't know. She's blood, and she's alone." He nodded. "So were you." The next morning, they rode out with the wagon to fetch Rebecca. But something about the woman didn't sit right from the start. She was younger than Nora remembered, dressed too fine for someone claiming hardship. Her eyes kept flitting toward Caleb, and her laugh was just a shade too loud when he spoke. Nora tried to be gracious, gave her the spare bed, shared food without complaint. But within days, something shifted in the house. Rebecca started telling the children stories that didn't line up, said she'd traveled far and wide, but her hands were soft and unused to labor, claimed she'd been helping tend animals, but recoiled when Clara tried to hand her a chick, and worst of all, she kept finding reasons to be alone with Caleb. "Let me help you with that, Caleb. Oh, I just love the smell of sawdust. Reminds me of my daddy. Didn't anyone ever tell you you've got such kind eyes?" Nora said nothing. She folded laundry with tighter fists and stirred soup with more force than necessary. She watched, waited. Until one night, as the children slept and the wind blew sharp against the shutters, she stepped out to the porch and found Rebecca standing far too close to Caleb, her hand resting on his arm. "I think we'd make quite the team," Rebecca was saying. "I know Nora's been through a lot, but you deserve someone who still knows how to smile, don't you think?" Nora's footstep on the boards made them both turn. "I do know how to smile," she said evenly. "I just don't do it for show." Rebecca turned red. Caleb stepped back. "I think it's time you left," Nora continued, voice steady. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "You'd throw out your own kin?" "I'd throw out anyone who tries to gut the only peace this house has had in years." Rebecca laughed, brittle and sharp. "He's not yours, Nora. You think fixing a fence and warming your hearth makes him yours? You think a few soft words can change what life took from both of you?" "I don't think anything," Nora said quietly. "I know what I see. And what I see is a man who showed up when no one else did, who's stayed, who's healed more than just broken hinges." Caleb hadn't spoken. Not yet. He stepped forward then, past Rebecca, and reached for Nora's hand. "I'm not looking for a partner who tries to outshine the darkness. I'm looking for someone who knows how to sit with it." His hand closed. Around hers. "I'm home," he said. Rebecca left the next morning. The children didn't ask why, and for the first time in months, Nora's heart stopped bracing for disappointment. But just as they began to settle into something close to peace, the sheriff returned. This time, he wasn't alone. And the man riding behind him was someone Nora had hoped never to see again. Clara's father. He reined in beside the gate, boots muddy, eyes sharp and calculating. "I heard my girl's been calling someone else Papa," he said, voice slick with mockery. Caleb stepped between him and the porch before Nora could move. "You need to leave," Caleb said, voice like stone. The man spat. "She's my daughter. I got rights." "No," Nora said, stepping forward, arms folded. "You lost those rights when you left us hungry and scared and too ashamed to ask for help. You don't get to show up now because you heard we're doing all right." The sheriff looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Clara appeared in the doorway. Rubbing her eyes, her father saw her and smiled. "Hey, Pumpkin, Daddy's home." She froze, looked from him to Caleb, and then, slowly, deliberately, she stepped to Caleb and wrapped her arms around his waist. "This is my papa," she whispered. The man's face darkened, but Caleb's hand rested protectively on her shoulder. "She's made her choice," he said, and as the wind picked up, Nora knew they were standing in something far stronger than fear. They were standing in family. The man on the horse spat again, this time toward the ground, but his gaze was locked on Caleb like a challenge had just been thrown and he was still weighing whether to pick it up. Nora watched every muscle in Caleb's shoulders stiffen. He hadn't taken his eyes off Clara's father, not once, and she recognized the stillness in his stance. It wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. The sheriff cleared his throat, shifting in his saddle. "Now, Holden, you've got no claim here if there's no court papers, and I ain't got any to enforce. You want custody, you'll need a judge, not a threat." Holden snorted. "I don't want custody. I just want to see my girl. Ain't no crime in that. You came here drunk the last time," Nora said, stepping beside Caleb now. "You left her hungry. You hit me." Her voice wavered but did not break. "You've been gone for 2 years. She cried herself to sleep every night for 6 months after you left. And now that she's found safety, you think you can just wander back and stake a claim? She's mine." Caleb's hand came up slowly, gently pushing Clara behind him. "No, she's not." Holden's knuckles whitened on the reins. "You going to make this your business, fence fixer?" Caleb didn't flinch. "It's already my business." The silence that followed was thick and slow. Even the wind seemed to still. Nora felt her breath catch when Holden reached to his belt. Not for a gun, but for the silver flask he always carried. He took a swig, wiped his mouth, and sneered. "You're going to regret stealing what was mine." "She was never yours," Nora said. "Not the way a child is supposed to be." He didn't answer, just turned his horse and rode off, the sheriff following after with a grim look over his shoulder, as if even he knew Holden wasn't finished. They stood still long after the sound of hooves faded. Clara clung to Caleb's leg, Daniel watching. From the window, the baby beginning to cry softly inside. Nora turned slowly toward Caleb, but he was already looking at her. "I'm not afraid of him," he said. She believed him. But she was. And that night, as she bolted the doors and set extra wood beside the hearth, she felt the old helplessness creeping back in, the kind that came when she used to lie awake wondering whether she and her children would survive the winter, or the man who was supposed to love them. It wasn't over. She knew that as sure as she knew the creak of every floorboard in her home. Holden wasn't finished. The following days passed in a brittle kind of peace. Caleb resumed repairs, kept the children close, and sharpened his axe with a new kind of silence in his eyes. Nora baked more than she ever had before, loaves of bread piling high on the table as if she could knead her fear into the dough and bake it into something useful. But even the children seemed to sense the change. Daniel stopped playing near the gate. Clara barely left Caleb's side. Even the baby fussed more often, as though the air had shifted and everyone was just waiting for the storm to finally break. And it did. On the 5th night after Holden's visit, Nora woke to the sound of glass shattering. She bolted upright. Caleb was already out of bed and at the door, axe in hand. Another crash. This one from the barn. Nora ran to the children, pulling them into the corner of the room, her body a shield. Clara sobbed into her shoulder. Outside, she heard shouting. Then a struggle. Then silence. Her heart thundered. "Caleb," she called, her voice cracking. No answer. She waited another minute, maybe 2. Then she rose, grabbed the rifle by the hearth, and stepped outside barefoot into the cold. The barn door was ajar. Inside, moonlight revealed Caleb hunched over a figure on the floor. Holden. His mouth bloodied. A pitchfork lay discarded beside him. Caleb's face was pale, but steady. "He had a torch," he said simply. "He wanted to burn the barn down. With you inside." Nora's knees buckled. She would have fallen if Caleb hadn't reached her in time. The sheriff arrived by sunrise. Holden was loaded onto a wagon, unconscious. This time, there were no warnings, no lectures, just a quiet nod and a promise that he'd never be allowed near them again. But safety wasn't instant. Trauma lingered like smoke after the fire. The children took turns sleeping in Caleb's arms, waking at every creak of the wind. Nora stayed close to them all, even as the guilt pressed into her chest like a stone. Guilt for letting Holden come close again, guilt for not knowing how to stop it, guilt for letting herself believe they were safe too soon. Caleb said little, but he built more than ever. He fortified the gate, reinforced the windows, stacked extra logs beside every entrance. And one evening, when the worst of the fear had started to ebb, he brought Nora a ring. It was simple, carved from pine. "I know you're not ready," he said, "but I needed to make it anyway, just to remind myself that some things don't have to be broken first to be real." She wept. She said nothing. She kept the ring in her apron pocket for days, holding it when the baby cried, when Clara asked for bedtime stories, when the wind howled, loud enough to make her shiver, and then one morning she slid it onto her finger. Caleb saw it, said nothing, just smiled. From that moment, the house changed. The fear receded. The children laughed again, and the woman who once thought her heart could never trust again began humming while she worked. But life wasn't done testing them. One afternoon, a rider approached bearing news from another town, news about an outbreak of fever. It had reached the nearby valley. People were dying. Within a week, Daniel had a cough. By the end of the week, Clara had it too. Nora didn't sleep. She sat by their bedsides, cool cloths on their heads, prayers on her lips. Caleb brewed teas, burned. Herbs built cots beside the fire. The baby, somehow, remained untouched, but the others burned with fever. And one night Clara stopped breathing, just for a moment, just long enough to make time stop. Caleb's hands didn't tremble. He lifted her gently, rocked her, whispered into her ear, "Stay with me, little one. I fixed your fence. I'll fix this too. Just stay." And she did. By morning, the fever broke. Both children began to sweat. 2 days later, they were sitting, up again, weak but smiling. Nora collapsed beside the bed and wept so deeply her ribs ached. And Caleb. He stepped outside into the cold morning and fell to his knees, thanking God through gritted teeth and tear-blurred eyes. Love, it turned out, wasn't loud. It was quiet, like a man carving toys by firelight, like a woman wiping fever from a child's brow, like a girl who called someone Papa, not because she had to, but because he earned it. And just as the land thawed and spring started to peek through the frost, the boys found a letter by the gate again. Not from Holden, from a stranger, a woman with 5 children. Abandoned, alone, begging for someone, anyone, to take them in. Caleb read it twice, then looked at Nora, and she nodded. "Build another room," she said, and he did. The letter came on rough paper, folded small like it was meant to be hidden, like the one who sent it had written it fast, with fear laced through every stroke. There was no return address, just a name, Monsieur Willoughby, and a description of where she might be found. It was in the valley 2 towns east, near the ridge where the land sloped toward the old iron trail, abandoned since the last engine. Passed years ago. The woman wrote of 5 children, all under 10, all hungry. Her husband had drunk himself into a stupor one night and disappeared the next, leaving only debts behind and neighbors who'd already turned their backs. Caleb read it aloud once, then folded it and set it on the table. Nora stood near the hearth, her hand over her mouth. She didn't speak for a long time. "You don't have to go," she said finally. But Caleb shook his head. "I think I already left the moment I finished reading it." Daniel, who sat nearby, carving a stick, looked up. "More kids?" Caleb gave a soft smile. "Maybe." Clara said nothing, just reached out and took his hand. The next morning, he packed his satchel and kissed the baby's forehead. Nora walked him to the edge of the yard, where the last of the snow was melting into muddy puddles beneath the fence he had once fixed with quiet hands. It felt like a lifetime ago. He paused before climbing onto the horse. "What if you come? Back with 6 more kids?" she asked, her eyes full and steady. "Then I'll need more wood," he said, tapping the axe strapped to his saddle. She nodded, trying not to smile too much. "Don't be long." He wasn't. 2 days later, he returned with a wagon, though it had broken down once on the trail and had to be patched with rope and pure will. The woman inside was gaunt, her face drawn and pale, eyes like glass too long, in the cold. The children were nearly silent. None of them cried. Not even the littlest boy, no older than 3, who clutched a torn blanket and stared at everything like it might disappear if he blinked. Caleb rode at their side. He walked most of the return trip so the children could lie down in the back. When they reached the farmhouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting soft gold across the field. Norit came out before he could call her name. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She helped the woman down, ushered the children inside, and passed around bowls of stew she'd started the moment she heard the horse in the distance. The baby clung to her hip but didn't fuss. Clara took one of the little girls by the hand. Daniel offered the older boy a toy he'd carved himself, a bear with crooked legs and no tail, but a proud chest and the tiniest smile. The woman, Margaret Willoughby, ate little. Her hands trembled. Her voice was weak but grateful. Caleb sat beside her quietly, only speaking when necessary. He understood what silence meant when it came from pain. You didn't fill it. You waited until it softened on its own. That night, the house stretched to accommodate 8 children. Nora moved, her bedroll to the floor beside the baby's cradle. Caleb took the rocking chair near the fire, and for the first time since Holden had broken in with fire in his heart, the walls seemed stronger not just in wood, but in the life they held inside. The days turned towards spring in earnest. The thaw gave way to blooms. And slowly, Margaret began to speak more. She had been a teacher once before marriage, Loved books. Used to write stories, she said, but hadn't touched a pen in years. Her children warmed to the others quickly. The little ones took to Daniel as if he were a brother from the start. The girls followed Clara through the fields with wild braids and worn shoes. They all listened when Caleb read aloud at night, his voice steady, low, like river water over stone. But not all wounds vanish just because warmth returns. One night, long after the children had gone to bed, Margaret sat alone on the porch. Nora stepped outside with 2 mugs of tea, passing one to her gently. "He used to say it was my fault," Margaret said after a long pause, "that I'd made him drink, that if I'd been better at keeping house, at smiling more, at being quiet, when he was tired, maybe he wouldn't have left." Nora sat beside her, staring out into the quiet. "I used to believe that," Margaret continued, voice barely above a whisper. "Now, I'm just afraid of what's left without the blame." Nora reached for her hand. "You're not alone." Inside, Caleb checked the locks again, added another log to the fire, and turned to see Clara watching him. "Papa," she whispered, careful not to wake the others. He froze. She'd called him that before, once, but never again until now. Didn't respond right away, just walked to her side and kneeled. "You scared?" he asked. She nodded. "Come on," he said softly, lifting her into his arms and carrying her to the rocker. She fell asleep against his chest before the chair, made a full sway. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He watched the fire fade. He watched the baby shift in her cradle. He watched the old scars in his heart curl a little tighter, not from pain, but from stretching around something new. The next morning, he built another crib. By summer, the farmhouse had tripled in laughter. Children chased each other across the yard, trailing chickens and feathers. Clara taught the others to braid with long blades of grass. Daniel began carving with more precision, figures of the whole family, one by one. Margaret started reading again, then writing. One afternoon, she handed Caleb a small journal. "I wrote it for you," she said. He opened to the first page. It was titled, "The Man Who Built a Home with His Hands and a Family with His Heart." He looked up. She smiled. "Not. Everything needs to be spoken to be understood." Nora stood behind her, holding the baby, her own smile tucked gently into the corner of her lips. But joy, like sorrow, brings its own storms, and they weren't prepared for what came next. It began with a cough. One of the new boys, Jude, barely 5, with a sprig of hair that always stuck up at the crown of his head. Then another child. Then another. The fever returned, same as it had before, but faster, harsher. Caleb and Nora had medicine this time. Herbs Margaret brought, poultices they'd learned to prepare. But the illness outpaced their efforts. 2 children were burning with fever within a day. Margaret didn't sleep. She moved between beds with quiet desperation. Nora held one child's hand in one room while rocking another in her arms. Caleb stood at the door, helpless. And then Jude stopped breathing. This time, Caleb ran. He didn't shout. He ran into the woods, axe left behind, satchel forgotten. Just him and the memory of a promise he'd never spoken aloud, that no child under his roof would be unloved. No child would be lost to silence again. He returned with a bundle of fresh herbs, bark from a tree Margaret had once said could ease lungs. It wasn't magic, but somehow Jude stirred, then coughed, then opened his eyes, then whispered, "Papa?" Caleb wept into his hands. When all 5 children finally opened their eyes the next morning, pale but alive, Nora set the bell by the fence to ring. She rang it 5 times, one for each night. Every child slept under one roof, and Caleb carved 5 more names into the beam above the hearth. The farmhouse wasn't just repaired, it was reborn. The bell above the fence remained quiet in the weeks that followed, but everyone in the house still glanced toward it from time to time as if daring it to chime again. The sickness had passed, the children had recovered, but something deeper had shifted. Something in Caleb, in Nora, in Margaret, in the very bones of the house. There were nights when Caleb would wake without reason, heart pounding as if something had called his name. He would sit near the fire, not moving, just listening to the silence around him and wondering if love was always meant to feel so precarious, like a roof barely holding under storm weight. Nora saw it. She knew the look in his eyes. She'd worn it herself once, right after burying her husband, when the baby was still small and the world still made no sense. She waited for Caleb to speak, but he never did. Not about the fear. Not about the way he sometimes traced the names above the hearth like they were fragile things he might lose just by breathing too loud. Margaret noticed too, but she didn't say anything either. Her place in the house had grown solid. Solid. Enough that the children called her Mama now, not because they were forced to, but because they forgot they once hadn't. She moved through the days with quiet purpose, and though her eyes were clearer than they'd been since she'd arrived, there was something she held tight still, something not even Nora had touched. And then came the news. A letter again. Folded neatly, no name on the outside, just placed under a stone near the fence found by Daniel when he went to feed the chickens. He brought it inside, eyes wide. Caleb opened it slowly, his fingers still rough with splinters from the chopping he'd done that morning. The words inside were short. I know where they are. The others. You can't keep them. There was no signature, no explanation, just a town name, Sutton Ridge, and a time, Sunday, noon. Margaret read over his shoulder, her face draining of all color. It's him. Caleb didn't ask who. He knew. The husband. The one who sold his children. The one who vanished and left Margaret with nothing but fear and names to whisper when she couldn't sleep. Her hands trembled as she stepped back from the table. I thought he was gone for good, she said. Nora stepped forward. What does he want? Caleb folded the letter again, slowly. To take them back. It wasn't a question. It was a fact, one that settled like a stone in the middle of the room. No. Margaret's voice shook. No, he can't. He gave them up. He signed. He didn't want them. He said so. He might not care about what he said then, Caleb murmured. He might care about what it looks like now, about what people will say when they find out you all are here and happy and he's not part of it. Margaret backed toward the wall. I can't lose them again. You won't, Caleb said. Not without a fight. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Caleb didn't go to the woods. He didn't carve. He didn't read. He sat near the window, sharpening the same knife over and over, though he had no intention of using it. He wasn't preparing for violence. He was preparing for truth, for whatever test lay ahead. He didn't know what the man would look like, but he knew he would know him the second he saw him. Sunday came with gray skies. The children played quietly. That morning, sensing something tense in the house, Margaret didn't eat. Nora braided the girl's hair in silence. Caleb dressed in his oldest coat, the one with the patch across the shoulder and the tear near the pocket. He took the wagon out front and hitched it to the horse. I'm going alone, he said. Margaret shook her head. No, you need to be here, he said gently. With them. Nora stepped forward. You shouldn't go alone. I won't be, he said, then looked toward the house. Not really. He left before anyone else could argue. Sutton Ridge was half a day's ride, more if the roads were soft, and they were. The rain from the night before had turned everything to mud. Caleb didn't push the horse. He let the time stretch, let his mind gather like smoke rising in an old chimney. He thought of Clara's first words to him, of Daniel's crooked smile, of the way Nora's eyes warmed whenever she looked at the baby asleep in the sling. He thought of Margaret's journal, of how every story she wrote began with pain, but ended in light. He reached the town square at 10 past noon. The man was already there. He stood beside a rusted cart with 2 mules tethered loosely to a hitch. His clothes were newer than expected, cleaner. His hair slicked back like he was trying to pretend he was someone better than he'd ever been. But his eyes were wrong. Hard. Empty. "You him?" the man asked, squinting. Caleb nodded once. "I am," the man snorted. "You don't look like much." "I'm not much," Caleb said. "Just enough." "Where's Margaret?" "At home. Thought maybe she'd come herself. Face me." Caleb stared at him a long moment. "She's faced enough." The man laughed, short, ugly. "Look, I ain't here for trouble. I just want what's mine." "You lost that right when you sold them. They're my blood." "No," Caleb said, stepping closer. "Blood doesn't sell blood." The man's smile vanished. "You threatening me?" "I'm standing here," Caleb said. "That's enough." "You can't stop me," the man spat. "I don't have to." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Margaret's handwriting, a sworn affidavit, a testimony, witnesses from the town she'd fled, signatures, a record of what he'd done. "I take this to the sheriff," Caleb said softly, "and you won't be leaving this town." The man lunged. Caleb didn't flinch. He stepped aside just enough for the man to trip forward, momentum carrying him into the mud. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak, just let him lie there, face down in the dirt, sputtering. The sheriff came not long after, not because Caleb called him, but because others had seen the man try to strike first. It didn't take long. By dusk, Caleb was riding home. The wind picked up on the way, sharp with coming rain, but he didn't slow down. He thought of the fire, of Nora's quiet hum when she thought no one was listening, of the baby's giggle, of Margaret's hand over her heart when she laughed too hard. He thought of every name carved into the beam above the hearth. He reached the house by nightfall. The porch light flickered. Someone had lit candles in the windows. He opened the door to silence. Then Nora stepped forward. Then Margaret. Then Clara. Then Daniel. Then the rest. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The storm broke outside, but the house held warm. Later that night, Margaret handed him a slip of paper, a new page from her journal. This one titled, "The Day We Stood Tall." "You didn't just fix our roof," she whispered. "You fixed our roots." He folded it carefully, then placed it in the drawer beside his bed. The next morning, the bell rang once, not for warning, but for joy. Another crib was built, another carving was started, and though the world outside still held its dangers, its drunkards, its cold men with dead eyes and cruel hands, inside this house everything was mending. Spring came like a quiet breath after all that had passed. The snow retreated slowly from the eaves, leaving behind rivulets that traced the dirt, paths between the trees, buds pushed up from ground once too frozen to yield. The children ran barefoot through the thawing grass, laughter echoing through the forest. The bell above the fence remained still. No threats came. No strangers passed. The world, for a time, had gentled. Inside the house everything changed, and nothing did. The names carved above the hearth remained: Caleb, Margaret, Nora, Daniel, Clara, Ruthie, Thomas, Grace, Samuel. But now there was another. Caleb had waited until they were all asleep, until the fire burned low and the moonlight touched the wood just right. Then, steady hand and quiet breath, he carved one more name. A name that hadn't belonged to him at first. A name he didn't. Expect to love. But did. Deeply. Papa! Because that's what Thomas had whispered one morning as he reached up, arms out, sleepy and sure, his hair tousled and his voice thick with dreams. Papa. Up. It had stopped Caleb cold. He hadn't responded right away. He'd just stared, unsure he'd heard it. But Thomas hadn't repeated himself. He hadn't needed to. He'd only rested his head against Caleb's chest and gone back to sleep there, breathing slow and even. That word. It stuck, like a seed in the soil of Caleb's heart. By the end of that week, all the children were saying it. Clara whispered, "It" at night. Daniel shouted it when he scraped his knee and ran for comfort. Ruthie slipped it in between her made-up songs as she played outside, and the baby, Grace, said it for the first time while pulling at his beard, gurgling like it was the funniest thing in the world. It should have frightened him. The weight of it, the permanence. But instead, it healed something in him that had sat hollow for years. He wasn't a replacement. He was a beginning. Margaret saw it. She'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to fall. Her journal was filled now. Not with pain, not with sorrow, but with sketches of the house, little poems about the smell of Caleb's flannel when he came in from the cold, tiny observations about Nora's laugh or Grace's dimples. Her writing, once tight and guarded, now poured like water over the pages, fluid and fearless. She had even sent one to a newspaper, under a new name, at Caleb's gentle urging. They printed it. She didn't tell anyone but him. "I don't want the world," she said softly. "Just this," and this was enough. Nora, too, found her voice. She began teaching the children how to read by the window, using old hymnals and Caleb's weather-worn Bible. She sang again, full-throated and brave, and once, on a Sunday evening when everyone had just eaten and the fire was roaring strong, she danced. Margaret clapped, the children laughed. And Caleb watched with a heart so full he thought it might split. The seasons continued their quiet turning. The garden, once a patch of weeds, burst into life. Nora had a gift for it. Tomatoes fat and red, corn sweet, potatoes like buried treasure. The children helped, muddy and joyful, and Caleb built a shed for the tools without anyone asking. He carved little figures into the door, animals, stars, their initials. Margaret called it his second Bible. In town, the gossip about the lonely lumberjack and his found family softened into admiration. No one questioned anymore. No one dared. The sheriff himself came by one afternoon with extra fence nails and offered to help raise a new barn wall. "You ever think about making it official?" he asked, nodding toward the children. Caleb looked over at them. Samuel and Daniel racing on wooden horses, Clara twirling in a dress Nora had sewn, Ruthie poking a stick into a knothole, and Margaret sitting on the porch with Grace asleep on her chest. "I think," Caleb said slowly, "it already is." Still, the sheriff returned a week later with paperwork. Adoption forms. Not a command, just a gift. Caleb didn't touch them that day. He left them on the table under a smooth stone from the river and walked out into the woods. When he came back, Margaret was waiting. "You don't have to do it," she said. "I know. But if you do—" She hesitated. "I'd like to sign too." They signed together that night. The children didn't need to be told. They sensed it. The way dogs sense rain. They celebrated without knowing why, dancing around the hearth while Caleb lifted each one and tossed them into the air, catching them again and again, each giggle landing louder than the last. That night, Clara sat beside his chair. "Papa?" "Yes." "Ladybug, does love ever go away?" He looked down, met her eyes. "No," he said. "Not real love. It might sleep for a while, might hide, but it doesn't go." "Even if you leave?" "Even then. Even if you stop remembering someone." He smiled softly. "I think," he said, "that's when love remembers you." Instead, she didn't ask anything else, just curled up beside him, her head on his leg, and fell asleep there. Margaret watched from the stairwell. Later, after the children were in bed, after Nora had retired with a soft hymn humming under her breath, Margaret walked outside with Caleb. The moon was high. The trees whispered. "Do you think this lasts?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I think," he finally said, "we make it last." She looked at him. "Even if more storms come?" He nodded. "Especially then." They stood there side by side, not touching, just listening. Then Margaret reached for his hand. "Do you think they'll remember the hard parts?" "No," he said, "only the hands that held them through it." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad you came. I'm glad you stayed." She was quiet a moment. Then, "I loved him, you know, my first husband. I thought we'd be forever." "I know, but I love you too." He didn't respond. She turned to face him. "Do you?" His eyes never left hers. "Yes." It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was enough to shake the stars. The next morning, they told the children together. Not with fanfare, not with speeches, just with a new carving above the hearth, Caleb plus Margaret, forever. The children stared. Then Ruthie pointed. "Did you spell forever wrong?" "Nope," Margaret said with a laugh. "That's how Papa spells it." "Papa's bad at spelling," Samuel said. "But good at hugs," Clara cried, launching herself into Caleb's arms. He caught her. He caught them all. And there, in a house built by hands once too broken to hope, a family lived. Not because blood said they should, not because papers made it legal, but because love demanded it. Daily, loudly, gently. And love, when fed by firelight and mended fences and stories, whispered between the lines. Never left. Not really. Not ever. The end.